Welcome everyone. To the second Ascali Business Education SIG's webinar series. I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands from where we are all joining today, and I pay my respect to their elders past, present, and emerging. So I'm joining from the land of Wurundjeri people. You're welcome to acknowledge in the chat box traditional owners of the lands from where you're joining today. I am Associate Professor Harsh Suri from Deakin University. I launched this SIG along with my colleagues Audrey Warner from Auckland University and Daniel Logan from Griffith University at ASCALite 2019 conference because we wanted to encourage business educators in raising a collective voice for informing relevant professional bodies and accreditation bodies about really what are the emergent design-based nuanced approaches to research and scholarship and effective teaching that we can adopt in business education. And today's topic is so much relevant to that. It just kind of, is so relevant to the core issues that we wanted to discuss. At Singapore conference, we were joined by a wonderful, vibrant steering committee members, Dr. Amanda White and Dr. Sandy Barker, Mr. Brent Gregory, and the six of us kind of took on board the advice that we got from our membership that it would be good to have 6 weekly webinars. So this is the second one in the series. The first one was jointly hosted by Daniel Logan from our SIG, along with Matthew Hillier from Transforming Assessment SIG. This one's hosted by Amanda, and we are joined by a wonderful panel that Amanda will shortly introduce. And the next webinar is on 11th of May, which is jointly co-facilitated by Associate Professor Christian Scott from Victoria University, Wellington, and myself. Please join me in welcoming Amanda, who's the Deputy Head Education of the Accounting Discipline in the UTS Business School. She's been part of business school for almost 20 years, and she's a well-known person in the ASCALite community. Amanda loves to audit, and she's dedicated to improving the student learning experience through the use of technology. And every time I look at Amanda speak, she kind of epitomizes to me the notion of what's an empathetic educator. Amanda recognizes that learning is a social and emotional journey for students, and she designs learning experiences with that in mind, as well as assessment experiences. She's been recipient of a UTS Individual Teaching Award, numerous faculty awards, an AAUT citation for outstanding contribution to student learning, and most recently, the AAUT Teaching Excellence Award for Law, Business, Economics, and related areas. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Amanda.
Thank you very much, Harsh, and welcome to everybody. I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, whose lands upon which the UTS campus stands, and I'm coming to you from Darug country here in Western Sydney. So welcome to everybody, and welcome to our seminar series. As I mentioned, my name is Dr. Amanda White, and we have a fantastic panel here with us today who are going to share some of their experiences with online assessment and invigilation and accreditation. So first up, and I've got their bios printed out so that I don't muck it up here. So we have Dr. Victoria Clout, and Victoria is a senior lecturer from UNSW Sydney. Victoria's research is to provide evidence for investors and other users of financial statements about the influence of choices and decisions of firm executives and managers on disclosures, with a view to protecting a fair and transparent disclosure regime. Her research has relevance to industry, market regulators, and investors, and she's an associate editor of Accounting and Finance and the Accounting Research Journal. Her current teaching is as a first-year undergraduate course in accounting, and she recently also co-edited a special issue of ARJ about business teaching during COVID-19. So a big welcome to Victoria. We also have Elizabeth Marsland with us today, and Liz is a sessional lecturer employed at QUT Business School. Liz is responsible for unit coordination, lecturing and tutoring in a wide range of undergraduate, postgraduate and MBA subjects, including financial accounting and computerized education. Liz is a CPA Australia member and a senior fellow of the Higher Education Academy. And it's really important, I think, to bring in that sessional voice into our panel today because they play such an important role in our business education. And then lastly, we have Professor Phil Hancock from UWA. He's a professor of accounting in the business school, and he was Associate Dean at Teaching and Learning in the Faculty of Arts, Business Law and Education from 2016 to 2020. Phil has over 40 years experience as an academic in a variety of positions in a number of public universities and one private education provider. Phil is a fellow of CPA Australia, Chartered Accountants Australia and New Zealand, and the Accounting and Finance Association of Australia and New Zealand, AFANS. He's received in excess of $1 million in research grants and has published widely in accounting and accounting education. He's developed many courses and has been involved in many course reviews for education providers, and he's a registered TEXA expert. In 2006, he received a National Carrick Institute citation for outstanding contribution to student learning, and in 2013 received an award for outstanding contributions to accounting education from AFAN. So a big welcome to all of our panelists. I can see a whole lot of other people have joined us as I've been reading out their bios. And so to set the scene, I guess I'll start with just a brief overview about accreditation. So accreditation is a process of evaluating programs and courses to ensure compliance with a set of criteria determined by the accrediting body. Now, in preparing for this webinar, I thought, I'm going to go around to a whole range of different faculties and get different perspectives on accreditation. And pretty much accounting was one of the few areas where the professional accrediting body still said we would prefer some invigilation. So they do have a process to allow people to waive that slightly, but it's been quite an interesting journey there. Assessment are tasks designed to ascertain how students perform against specified learning outcomes and graduate attributes. Online learning is learning delivered in an online format, including synchronous and asynchronous delivery. And I don't know about you, but my university is talking about never going back to paper-based exams again. So it'll be interesting to see where exams are coming from. And then invigilation is watching over candidates to prevent cheating, a process to ensure the student enrolled in the subject is completing the assessment task. And if you've read any of Philip Dawson's work around assessment security and online, certainly there's lots to say about invigilation and really the process about verifying the identity of students, making sure that the work they turn in is their own. Now, if you're new to Collaborate Ultra, please make sure that for most people we ask that only the speakers have their microphones unmuted. There is a chat box, so you will be able to see on your right-hand side of your screen a little purple tab with two little arrows. If you click on that, that'll open the chat box. There's also a participants window there that you can see who is in the room with us. So welcome, everybody. You can also tag me as well on Twitter. I should have put Victoria's Twitter on there as well. She's also, Dr. Victoria Clout is on Twitter as well. So let's look at the relationship between invigilation and assessment. So some professional accreditations require invigilation. And it's CPA Australia and Chartered Accountants Australia and New Zealand. Everybody here presenting on our panel are from accounting faculties. And CPA Australia and Chartered Accountants require at least 50% of assessments to be invigilated. But there's a little bit of mixed messaging because when you actually look at the guidelines on their websites, it says, although not being prescriptive, there is a general expectation that at least 50% of the assessments for subjects meeting the professional body's required competency areas should be invigilated. So it says, although not being prescriptive, but in talking with many of the assessors for the professional bodies, they have said 50% invigilation is the requirement. Now, due to COVID-19, they have got a program that allows organisations to opt out of invigilation as long as they're providing some other way to try and verify the identity and ensure assessment security. So what is happening across the board? Well, what we have here is results from the ACODE COVID-19 exam software survey. And the chairs of accounting and finance did some discussions amongst themselves, and information I've received, though not publicly available, says the split is about 50-50, and that tends to match up with what a code did in their software survey in 2020. So out of the institutions that they surveyed, so there were 51% that did have a proctoring solution and 23% that did not have a proctoring solution. So, what is the UTS experience? All of our accredited subjects had formal online exams with invigilation. A really interesting question that comes across here is who decides whether accreditation, whether invigilation is something like proctored exams is something that we actually have in place. At some universities, that decision was made at a university level, where Monash, for example, and I believe Deakin also agreed at a university level, we're not going to have proctoring in place. Other universities decided at a university level that proctoring would be in place. Some universities had the flexibility at a faculty level to make a decision, and others had the flexibility at a school or discipline or unit level. So I'd love to see in the chat here, we have 37 people, whether proctoring was something, did you make that decision? How was that decision made? I'd love to hear a little bit more from different people as we're going through about, did you have proctoring and was that decision made at your level or above? So we use ProctorU. The downside to ProctorU was that there were thousands of ProctorU reports of flags of issues, earbuds, beanies, students sitting exams in libraries and people walking past. So there were thousands of reports for the exams reviewed by central exams team. So every time a ProctorU report did come up, it did need to be individually reviewed by a real human to make sure that we checked whether it was misconduct or not. Probably a good 90% of our ProctorU reports ended up being false flags that didn't end up being evidence of misconduct, and about 10% we decided was important enough to investigate in more detail. That's when somebody actually sat down and watched the footage from start to finish. So if you can imagine on 1,600 students, about 10%, even if 5% need to be investigated, that's a lot of people hours. But we did have an increased number of overall misconducts. Students who just forgot that they couldn't write on a scrap of paper, or that they shouldn't be looking at materials, answering the phone, a whole range of other things. So we had an increase in the number of cases that was officially referred. And I'm looking at the chat here, it's really interesting. At my university at UTS, we are discouraging, we're trying to move away from formal final exams, but proctoring is available, and the biggest users of proctoring are the business faculty. When it comes to non-accredited subjects, so all of our accreditation related subjects, for non-accredited subjects, there was a mix of invigilated and take-home exams. And we saw certainly a big uptick in academic integrity cases from take-home exams where students thought that they could copy information off Chegg, they could share information with each other in those take-home exams and turn it in, picked those up. Where we found was a big challenge was trying to detect cheating in timed LMS exams and also the online LMS invigilated exams, because there's not a nice, neat solution to export 1,600 student, responses into an exam, written responses, and check them for invigilation. Somebody said Zoom invigilation or Zoom observation, and funnily enough, I've just written a position paper with our central teaching and learning team on Zoom invigilation, and that's where we watch students. I guess there is the feeling of the panopticon that students are watching, someone is watching students while that is happening. But one of the issues with that is we can't see what they're doing. So even if the browser's not locked down, we won't see whether students are texting a friend. There was an article in, I think, the Chronicle today that Snapchat has become the latest cheating tool in the United States, where students are sitting in their rooms doing a take-home exam or doing a timed LMS exam, Snapchatting to each other. So, yeah, the idea that the teacher is doing the watching, but that's really only going to pick up if students visibly do something they're not supposed to do, or you hear them talking to a friend. So it is an option, and one that we've determined probably isn't as secure as it could be, but if you're in a pinch, that's a good way to go. So now I'd like to hand the microphone over to Victoria, and Victoria's going to talk about her experience at UNSW. And I remember being online with Victoria when she had her first, because UNSW has a slightly different exam schedule, she was trialing out proctoring before anybody else was. So Victoria, tell us about how it went.
So hi everyone. Yes, so this is to go through the experience of exams. It's sort of a journey. So we started off term 1, 2020 with invigilated webcams, but only for the core accounting courses. The elective courses could switch to take-home exams or uninvigilated exams. And we started off with one particular provider who was going to have human proctoring, but they offshored where they have the people watching, which is, it's in India. And when COVID swept through India, that company got shut down. So then we were substituted with a product which was artificial intelligence. But the problem was there was no human to talk the student through step by step, calmly, this is what you're going to do. And so we did have a lot of stress, anxiety of students, and I had to actually step into the breach and create videos to actually help students and kind of together myself of what I thought was happening inside of the proctoring software, because I've worked out the proctoring software companies are very secretive. They're not going to share with any academics what it actually looks like inside their system, which is incredibly sort of difficult because we're used to having all of the answers as being lecturers. So we started off with that. The AI did have problems. We had scale problems, and I've seen that Connor is in the audience, and Connor had thousands of students. Even though they were kind of grouped into batches of 200, they were still having problems logging in. So that wasn't really a scalable solution, but still it was giving us some security. Term 2 until now, so we've had no webcam proctoring. The decision was made from high above in the university. We're not sure where, that no proctoring, that was off the table. And then we had to use randomized test banks. We got students doing a declaration embedded inside the exam, so they have to click and say that they agree to those terms and conditions. And we're having a fixed time frame, and we have random test banks. So these measures, they can reduce the collusion, but the challenge is authentication. So what's the future, as Amanda's saying, what's the future of exams? Because at UNSW, it's possible we may not even have exams. The universities, are pushing us maybe in the direction of no exams, but then what kinds of assessment do we have then? So there's those challenges, because the universities haven't had to pay for, let's say, hiring out the Randwick race course to have students sit there and take their exam papers. But so to give you just a bit of a snapshot, so exams online, no proctoring, you can do those randomized test banks, you can generate random numbers. Different numbers generated. You can have the no-go back option, very unpopular though. I saw this come up on Twitter in a discussion, and then 20 different people went on immediately and went, no, students hate the no-go back, where they have to do each question in sequence, but that's the strongest measure to prevent of collusion and having that random test bank. But so measures for reducing outsourcing, this is a bigger hurdle, because you have to actually try and do authentic assessment, use maybe current newspaper articles, thing, to really be bespoke, because those outsourcing companies, they actually really like stock standard textbook type end of chapter solution questions. That's really what they want. They don't want authentic questions. But that's the challenge in trying to write those types of questions and to ask deeper knowledge questions rather than questions that could be copy and pasted. But that is difficult when you're teaching first year accounting. There's only so many ways you can ask these kinds of questions. So the experience, what are there are some sort of negatives of that. Students want detailed feedback, detailed marking guides. They actually openly now amongst each other that they have Facebook groups, they're going to crowdsource, they're going to work together. They'll say it in front of the lecturer, they'll say it in the Zoom group chat in front of the lecturer, hey, we've got a Facebook group, this is what we're doing. But how do we push back against that? There's often answers copy pasted from the internet. So there's lots of these challenges. There's also limited abilities to send announcements. That's a big problem with online exams, and that they have to be written as open book exams, very different to closed book exams. So, and also I want to just plug some papers from the Accounting Research Journal. I've seen that Ellie Chappell, who's the editor-in-chief, is in the audience here, and that we've actually got some papers, 3 of these with UNSW co-authors, that they talk about in detail the kinds of exams that they've created to try and address this open invigilation. So some of these are already online, for example, Wong and Zhang, and they've created an authentic assessment, so an exam that was really hard to outsource, and even some of the students communicated with the current, you need to do the work yourself. And there's 2 other articles are forthcoming talking about the design of the exams. So I think that's my time up, and I'm happy to, have a chat in the chat box. Over to you, Amanda.
Thank you, Victoria, and some fantastic stuff coming out in the chat as well. Tom Worthington mentions about ANU Computing has been using self-invigilation. Students encouraged to create a recording they can submit about any concerns that they might have, which sounds really fantastic. There's some links there on how to find out more. So next I wanted to bring Liz up, and Liz has a really important perspective. Yes, we have a lot of full-time academics working in higher ed in accounting, but we have a very high number of sessional academics, and they do a lot of work, and I think it's really important to recognize their perspective. So Liz, when you're ready, take it away.
Thanks so much, Amanda. I'm so really happy to be here today and to provide that sessional perspective. So from my perspective, starting with flow-on effects for academics, so I think Andrew West mentioned QT went down the no invigilation path. So that was the pathway that was destined for us. So the flow-on effect was definitely an increased workload for exam setting in terms of being able to, make that shift. Victoria mentioned from essentially a closed book exam to an open book exam, and thinking around, what does an exam look like that we can still make sure learning goals and things have been met in that environment. I also saw, there was a lot of workload to set those exams, but also review them, and also to create practice exams, because we identified in many cases if we don't provide the students with a realistic practice experience, it will be very stressful. And Amanda, before the session you were mentioning, your own fears around being able to complete an assessment like this. So I know in my unit I had quite a realistic practice exam as well, to give them more that sense of the feel of what it would look like and feel like. The other thing that I thought was interesting was once you've got over those hurdles, I've set the exams, I've had the exams reviewed, you know, I've set some practice exams. Well, now how do we mark these things? You know, and that I think semester one, I underestimated how difficult it would be to purely mark an online exam. So I think semester two, I was in a much better place to really design my exams well for marking and efficient marking, and I think that's something that I've seen huge benefits from that regard. From a sessional perspective, in semester one, 2020, we were allocated a small amount of extra funding to recognise increased workload, and that was a one-off, but was definitely appreciated. From the students' perspective, you know, I think there's a lot of wins here. In the sense for my unit, which is a first semester postgrad, essentially an introductory accounting subject, you know, we typically, you know, as Victoria mentioned, you're sort of going around in circles having the same sorts of questions. But when you move to an open book environment and you can bring in really different questions, thinking out the box, you know, Victoria mentioned that, you know, bringing in newspaper articles or bringing in annual reports, or so I think my creativity really was tested to really start to think about, you know, how can I bring contingent liabilities in, you know, what would be a great example to, you know, to bring that in. And certainly there were some amusing responses to my you know, whitewater rafting disasters. You know, the students maybe didn't know anything about contingent liabilities, but told me all about how I should do whitewater rafting or whatever it might be. The big thing I think was really helpful was that we could bring in real world examples in assessment. So things like the cash flow statement that I think traditionally probably might be quite hard to do a good cash flow manually. With Excel, that becomes, you know, quite useful, and I think a really useful assessment piece. So a template in Excel was created. They got that same template in the practice. So I thought that was a massive win. But we did need to change and reflect on learning goals. As Victoria mentioned, it couldn't be too, you know, it couldn't be too knowledge and skills. They really had to be thought around application and analysis, and to sort of prevent the copying and paste situation. QUT did have an academic integrity statement which the students had to move through, but they didn't actually have to do anything with that. So I did have some academic integrity issues, and we could see the student had actually they just jumped through it. They hadn't actually completed it, but they'd gone through the step. In terms of the way that QUT approached the online assessment, there were quite a few different options. Blackboard test, Blackboard assignment were the main sort of options in the accounting units that I was aware. So I went down the Blackboard test option where I had a number of pools of questions. Other unit coordinators went down a downloadable Word file alternative. But I was really comfortable with the pool of questions approach. And that Blackboard test environment, as I understand it, doesn't enable Turnitin unless there is manual processing from the unit coordinator. Whereas then you've got your Blackboard assignment, which does enable Turnitin. And there were a variety of time windows that unit coordinators could suggest in terms of what was possibly going to be useful for their unit. And, you know, for myself, I went for the narrower window that I could to try and give me confidence that we didn't have multiple students sitting the same exam. In terms of the reflections, look, I think a lot of this from my perspective, despite some initial workload issues, I think has been really, really useful. I think the ability to give students some real world assessment and really make them how to think and apply it, I think that's a massive win. And in my unit, certainly, I didn't really see a big difference in results, which I think was very, very pleasing, in the sense that, you know, we were getting similar numbers of 7s all the way through. A slight increase in the fails, but I think some of those were students that just didn't work well in the online environment for the whole semester, not just the assessment itself. So from my perspective, I found using a lot of different question styles was really beneficial, which also Victoria mentioned. You know, multiple pools also really helpful, and some of those, in some cases, you know, we've just kept increasing the pools to try and give us a little bit more comfort around the randomisation there. The approach Victoria mentioned also in terms of making sure they can't be questioned that can be Googled is certain, and I used that when I was setting exams to make sure, you know, that nothing suitable was popping up in that, and that was in some cases just needing a lot of creativity. And finally, in terms of maybe some suggestions for workload, in some cases I was able to just add some new pools to the, you know, some of the exams we'd already created. So we've still got, you know, a nice randomisation happening, and it can assist the workload in some way. The other thing that we've been experimenting with is giving students templates, whether that's in Excel or even a little Word sort of template in the question that they can copy and paste straight into their Blackboard test box. So it just gives them a little bit of structure and I guess a little bit of comfort in terms of how I should answer this and to save them a little bit of time. And finally, around the real thought into how do I mark this efficiently, and once I had nailed that, particularly with some large Excel questions where I could put some sort of a column down the side for the marks and things, something like a cash flow statement, that really cut down my workload as well. But from my perspective, I think the move to online exams has been very beneficial, but I do have concerns as to who is actually sitting those exams. Yeah, but that's a separate issue. So thank you so much, Amanda.
Fantastic, thanks Liz. And for anybody who's on Blackboard, if you're interested, I saw a fantastic presentation from a group in the United States somewhere where there's actually a hidden setting where you can set up 4 different tests and have students randomly allocate when they log in to one of those 4 tests as well. So if you wanted to up the randomization even more, I saw that at I think the Midwest region of the International Center for Academic Integrity. So now we have Professor Phil Hancock, and Phil has a wealth of teaching experience at the coalface level as an Associate Dean Teaching and Learning. So Phil, why don't you tell us about UWA's experiences when it came to accreditation and online assessment?
Thanks, Amanda. It feels like much of what's been said already is going to be repeated, so I'll keep some of that short and talk about, I guess, a few particular issues at UWA. If I turn my camera off part of the way through, it's because my sort of Wi-Fi seems to be a bit hit and miss at the moment. So some great suggestions in the chat button, and particularly the self-invigilation one, Danielle. I'm really going to follow that one through as well. So at UWA, we were one of the universities that Amanda mentioned made the university decision. So we had 4 faculties last year. We no longer have faculties. We have 22 schools. That's another issue. But the 4 ADLTs were members of the Academic Stream Working Party, and the group recommend, and others, of course, for the DVCE, recommended the VC. At that stage was the acting VC, Jane de Hollander. That really ExamSoft, if we wanted to have invigilated exams, seemed to be the best option. Of course, the medical profession was reluctant to provide any exemption, if you like, to invigilation. It was one of the few, I suppose, that were pretty insistent still. So the university felt we needed to have some form of invigilation. So we went to ExamSoft too, and much what Amanda said, I can simply repeat essentially. But you'll note we decided not to continue in 2021 because of all the problems with the invigilation, which Amanda's mentioned. So there's the number of the exams that we had in semester 1 and semester 2. By semester 2, we were pretty fortunate in Perth, and we were able to have some on-campus exams. ExamSoft was the one that was most used. The law faculty used it, but they had open book exams. What the law faculty wanted, because Fable includes the law's several schools, one of which is the law school, so they wanted the integrity of the student showing their ID at the start of the exam and ExamSoft. So they validated the student who was supposed to sit an exam was sitting it. And that's what they wanted. The whole school used ProctorU, but they had open book exams, and that was a school decision. So whilst the university decided to adopt ExamSoft, it wasn't mandated across all faculties that the ExamSoft had to be used. Hence the variation around use of LMS exams. So LMS exams were used very much by the schools of humanities and social sciences, whereas law, business, largely went to ExamSoft in semester 1. In semester 2, you can see there was some on-campus exams, but the ExamSoft was still used widely by the law school and by business because of all the students offshore. So the outcomes of using it, however, were similar to what Amanda said. So we had about 80,000 exam sittings across both semesters at EWA. I must admit, like Amanda said, there was some trepidation when we first went into the first week of exams in semester 1, but we did have a number that students could ring if there was any issues, and there was, I think, 3,000 or 4,000 calls to that. The average response time was, I think, about 2.5 seconds or something. So the dealing with students' concerns in the online environment was actually done very well. So from that point of view, and there wasn't any crashes. So the issue, however, really is the artificial intelligence, and the fact that ProctorU is moving to a different artificial intelligence, I guess, is evidence that there are some issues with it. And as Amanda said, huge numbers of the flags, many of which were not really misconduct, and the cost of investigating all of these is quite huge. So we investigated most, but I don't think we investigated all of them because the flags were being raised when you raised your eyebrows, or it was ridiculous. Obviously, there's been some talk with the open and closed book exams. The open book exams were used, as I said, entirely by the law school. I've used open book exams in my MBA accounting for several years, and just as being said by others, the questions obviously are important. And I use questions based on the current media, where students have to apply concepts. So they find them challenging, and it's not something you can Google or get anything from Google on. So certainly open book exams require us to think differently about the sort of questions, but certainly the evidence shows that open book exams are fairly difficult if we've set them properly. We had, so some of the investigations into some of the issues were ridiculous. So we had some flagged as flags and the student was simply looking up. We had others where the student was talking to someone else and that wasn't a flag because our student experience did a random sample of all the videos. So it clearly was unsatisfactory. What I will say is going forward, so we've not continued with ExamSoft. We are exploring the idea of exam centres in China, in particular, where we unfortunately we've had 2 staff members locked up there for 12 months. They both were visiting relatives, and we have offshore learning centres, which I know other universities do. So we're exploring the idea of having exam centres in a couple of locations, probably Beijing and Shanghai, online and face-to-face exams in Perth, assuming nothing untoward happens, to cover most of our students in the exam setting and potentially have Zoom invigilated exams for those that can't get to an exam center or those that are located in other countries. That's what we're exploring at the moment, but we haven't got the go-ahead for exam centres at the present time. Speaking to James Cook University, Jody, they're looking at having the online exams with a random sample of students to orally defend their exam, which the self-invigilation that Danielle has put on there, I think is even more attractive. So we're, and obviously attempting to move to more open book exams is, I guess, one of the ways to try and deal with this. The new CA program, if you haven't looked at it, do have some units where there aren't any invigilated exams. So for the chartered accountants to be looking to move away from invigilated exams, at least for some of their units, is, I guess, heartening for us as well. That's probably enough from me, Amanda. I'm happy to move on and go to the panel session.
Fantastic, thanks Phil. And Phil's right, the CAX program does have some units that don't have any invigilated exam, but I think the student has to provide a walkthrough presentation. So it sort of sounds a bit like that self-invigilation option that I think, I can't remember, somebody mentioned, where the students have to walk through a dashboard, some sort of data dashboard that they've constructed, explain how they've constructed it, make a screencast. So there certainly is some really interesting ideas out there. I put a link in the chat to a Padlet also that we've got going today as a bit of a resource for everybody. I'll put the link in again, where if you've tried something, you've got something to be wary of, that we recommend, we'd love for you to share it. In there I can already see interactive oral assessments, which are based on some work that I saw at Griffith University and Danielle Logan and Poppy and the team up there. And I love an interactive oral discussion for my supplementary exams where students are borderline, they're due to graduate, they've just not got enough marks. We give them a pass-fail supplementary exam. It's 15 minutes of a conversation, and it tells me really early on, even in the first 5 minutes, I can tell who knows what they're talking about and who doesn't, and we just have a conversation. But in trying to schedule that for 1,600 students or more, it can be quite difficult. And yes, so all of the resources in the chat, I'm also going to I'll try and download the chat afterwards and put as much of that as possible into the Padlet so that we can move forward. And Andrew makes a good point here. It doesn't have to be exams. Invigilation doesn't have to be exams. It could be a 50% presentation. Though I imagine for a presentation to be worth 50% of your grade, I don't know how big a presentation that might be and how we might work that in really large cohorts. So for my panel, I've got Victoria and Liz and Phil and myself. I'm just going to stop sharing the slides for a moment so that there's a chance of, I guess, seeing us more on the screen here. So for Victoria, you had the possibility of an online proctored exam and then it went away because of a whole lot of issues that you had at UNSW. Do you wish that you'd have that option back within your arsenal to choose to use?
Yes. And it's mainly for the authentication issue, because we just don't know, are the students sitting their own exams? This is the #1 challenge. So we would, kind of welcome them back, even though we had technology problems with the provider we went with. And we still do have like 1,000+ courses, thousands of students. How do we efficiently assess them? And like, it would be great to be able to do oral exams, but with 1,000 students, how do you do that?
Yeah, I think that's the big challenge. And even if you've got, I think in first year accounting, I believe we have 18 tutors. So, when we mark exams right now, 2 people will mark one question on that exam to ensure consistency. And when we move to interactive orals, I really love the idea, but I worry about the consistency of the marking there. That can be a little bit tough. A question here for Phil, since you've been an ADT&L, and you're the one who probably has more idea about budgets and that type of thing. When it comes to the financial considerations, the budget pressures, should we be thinking about the cost of assessment? you know, and I talk to my university and they say, oh, well, look, it's 15 minutes of marking time. That's, you know, if you want to do something that's 30 minutes of marking time, that's quite expensive. I'm like, well, hang on a second. Let's think about the total cost. And I feel like I have to give a costing lesson when I have this conversation. So as somebody who's involved at the higher levels, is there discussion about the cost of assessment, and is that something that we should be talking about?
Well, there is, obviously, given the financial constraints we're all operating under, and you know, with the change in the agreement with casual staff a couple of years ago, or 5 years ago, where marking, well, at least in WA, was included in the allowance and then was separated out and had to be paid extra. So the cost of marketing suddenly was a line item in the budget. And the business school, in our business school, it was, I think, around $1 million. So one of the challenges, of course, is if you're AACSB accredited, then you have to have evidence for assurance of learning. And so at UWA, we certainly allowed units where we're collecting evidence from to have, if you like, a bit more budget for marking, because it clearly does influence what you're assessing when you need evidence for AOL. But yeah, no, certainly the budget does come into it. And, you know, so at UWA, what happens is the marking estimate is done for each unit. Another idea is, well, let's give every unit, according to their student numbers, give them an allowance per student numbers, and let them do what they wish with it. A few
That's
people suggest that.
It
hasn't got off the ground yet, but a few people have suggested that.
I think we have some people from Griffith University here, and I think the last time I was at an event with Griffith, they said in the business school there is a 45-minute allowance for marking per student per subject, and I thought, wow, imagine what I could do with marking at 45 minutes per student. I think at the moment I have 15 minutes for their final exam, and I think I have about 10 minutes for their other assessment tasks worth 25%, and then they do a quiz in the class that is marked automatically, and then I have some sort of admin time to sort of get that set up. But I thought, what could I do with 45 minutes? Liz, in your experience, as a sessional and you're a coordinator, how does this information get conveyed to you about exams and marking and how much time you should spend?
So we get an allocated amount per unit for 50 students or whatever it is, and that gets equated down and worked back. That's been a fairly historical sort of amount, and I think some units that are more text focused really struggle with maybe 5,000 word assessments, and other units, maybe like your computerized accounting or your financial accounting, potentially may be easier to mark because they're more numeric.
Yeah, I guess in some options, if you're using an algorithmic type question, then there can be some automated marking there. And I'm really interested I'm keeping an eye on the chat here about, well, theoretically, 15-minute interactive orals for 1,000 students and 18 assessors would be about 14 hours per assessor. And yeah, so it's an interesting challenge there. Victoria, how does information come to you about how much time you should spend on marking, and does that affect your decisions about assessment? Oh, is Victoria frozen? I can see her picture. Oh, there you go.
I think I'm a bit frozen. Usually it comes through the faculty's education committee that we get told information. So some things are very clear and some things aren't. Like, we do have a lot of rules around assessment. So, for example, maximum 30% is for a group assignment, can't go above. We have guidance that it should be 3 assessment items, but that's not in concrete. But yeah, it tends to be like the faculty education committee.
It seems to be there's a lot of what we often call hidden curriculum, like things we should know but are not written down anywhere, that you find out by working with somebody or somebody tells you something, and that becomes a little bit difficult.
Yeah.
Has anybody experienced, want to share any unintended consequences? I was at a different session for a different conference today, and they said, well, maybe this whole move to online is the kick in the pants that we might need to rethink assessment. Is that something that you think is happening? I know Liz shared some examples of that, but do we think that it's really going to change where accounting has been? We seem to, be a bit slow in making big changes as a profession, but does anybody think that it's really going to give us the kick in the pants that we might need to change things? Who wants to?
I think some of us, Amanda, are bolder and braver than the others. Some of us will take up the mantle of doing something different, but other people know they want to get back to normal business as usual, face-to-face classes, So perhaps some of us will go forth and innovate, and some of us will sit back and not innovate. There's kind of two speeds in our accounting academia kind of thing.
Yeah. Certainly, Amanda, when I look across the departments in the business school, the accounting department has traditionally had mid-semester exams and final exams, much more so than any other department. Management, marketing, economics, it's somewhat historical, and I guess people might argue that it's due to the professional body requirements for invigilated assessment, but it's often much more than 50%. So I don't know, Amanda. I suspect maybe the change will be temporary.
I think one of the challenges that we face in comparison to North America and to Europe is our higher education regulation prevents us from prescribing a technology tool, for example, for assessment. So you want students to have access to something that's $10 or $15. The university has to pay for it. My colleagues in North America say, oh, no, I want them to use this particular assessment system and it requires access. I just tell them to pay for it. And it's $15 and away they go. Yeah. And it's very interesting here that often, especially in business schools, I don't know about anybody else, but it often feels like we're asked to teach students, Band-Aids and duct tape. It's just you, the textbook, and the room. And you would never ask a scientist to teach chemistry without chemicals. But somehow business, from our historic perspective of generating lots of revenue, seems to be very low cost, and trying to get permission to spend $20,000 on something for a whole range of students can be really difficult. Is that the feeling other people are having, or their experiences?
Look, yes. Don't start me, Amanda. This is one of my bugbears. I was chair of the ABDC L&T group for a number of years, and the reality is that the financial model that we have in Australia, where we can't charge students, as you said, in America they can. So things like the license of Harvard business cases, right? So the model is based on, so those that have a license with a Harvard business, it's still based on the number of students. So the more cases that get used, the higher the fee and so on. It's fairly prohibitive. So unfortunately, we really aren't able to charge the students to access online resources. And so we have to absorb it in our budget. Our budgets are fairly limited. So it is a challenge, absolutely.
And Liz, what is your perspective at QUT? If you needed something, an online tool or access to something, is that something that's easy for you to get access to for your students?
There has been some move with the accounting software. For example, moving from freely available software into software such as Xero, where there was, as I understand, to be charged a small value per student, and the willingness was there, as I understand, because the university reflected that Xero was, really highly relevant and sought after. So I think Phil's comment, though, it depends on the pricing. As I understand, the price point of Xero wasn't prohibitive, so that was good. But certainly, any versions of software that are free are certainly welcome, so that there's not a cost to the university there. I think the move to the open book exams, like I love it in that I think I can give something to students that reflects what they might see in a workplace. So if we can achieve that, I think that's a good step forward. When I think back to my closed book exams, I don't think they set students up well to demonstrate they actually understand or can apply the knowledge. They've just memorised a whole heap of things, or the open book exams and really thinking through the application, I think, is really useful.
Sorry, I had to mute there. Somebody must have been walking past my front door and my dog went crazy. So yeah, we've had some really interesting discussions here. I'd like to open it up to the audience. If the audience has any questions, you can just raise your hand, or if you want to share something or share some insights, please raise your hand, or you can ask the question in the chat. The chat's moved a lot. I haven't quite kept up with all of it here, but we have some fantastic people with experience in all different forms of assessment, learning designers as well as academics here in the room. I think the last thing I saw was feedback fruits was about 200 comments ago. So it's great to see that all the comments are here. But if anyone has a question they want to ask or a comment, just on the bottom of the toolbar, there's the little hand there. So let's just see what's coming. Oh, hang on. I'm trying to scroll. A question here from Andrew West that says there seems to be a push to move away from exams forever. Does anyone ever see that happening? I think for first year, I don't think I'm going to be able to. I don't think I could get away from an exam as much as I would like to try. But do we think we'd ever move away?
I think some universities are going to give it a red hot go to totally ban exams. We'll have to watch and see.
Yeah, I'd love for accounting to be under that observational model. So nursing and a lot of health sciences, students have to be observed doing one of the important tasks as part of the assessment. Obviously in nursing, they hire people to be patients. Each student is students work in groups. They're observed by at least 2 markers in the room. There's a whole lot of equipment. I love that idea. I can't ever imagine. I find it difficult to imagine a future in which I would get that proposal and its costs approved, unless somehow I manage to recruit a whole lot of graduates and alumni as volunteers in that way. But yeah, I think that even CA and CPA are still going to have exams. I think CPA are still moving with online exams, and they're going to close down their exam centres. I liked Phil's comment about having exam centres. Yes. Okay. What else can we see? Karen has said that she started seeing KPIs related to reductions in exams. I can tell that that's something that we have at our university as well. And someone says, is anyone surprised by the willingness of students to embrace new tech solutions? I think students are keen to try anything. I think we're the ones who are probably a bit more apprehensive. And Andrew says here, I think timed assessment has a lot of value, but there are some who struggle to believe it can be authentic. I was actually, I think Peter Westcott's still here, but I was talking with Peter earlier this week in which, how many times do we get something in real life that says, oh my gosh, we need to figure this out yesterday. Let's go. And so certainly that's going to be something that I think a timed exam still can be authentic. I'm just trying to, if I use enough pedagogical jargon, apparently that will fool any committee. Harsh has a really great comment here. Medical schools across Australia collaborated to develop large scenario-based databases of MCQs. That is a really fantastic idea. I think I saw something about this on Twitter where I think psychology academics from a range of universities got together for one day from different universities and wrote a stack of questions together that they shared in that specific year. So, yes. Danielle asks, has anyone looked at student sentiment around exams? I have seen some from my institution in which students the first time around really didn't, just confused about the whole process, as Victoria mentioned. Second time around of using online exams, they seem to be getting into the groove of it. So I think it's a change management type of issue there. I'm just trying to go back through the chat. All right. Okay. So, just in case anybody hasn't seen it, there is the Padlet as well that is going on where people are sharing different forms of assessment. I'm going to go back through all of the chat and pick out the different ideas like this massive medical school database. I think that there would be a great one. Danielle has a question here. Authentic assessment versus exams experience. Danielle, do you want to unmute your microphone and elaborate on your question a bit more?
Thanks, Amanda. Thanks, everyone. Hello. Just wondering, we were talking about the student sentiment around exams, and you spoke about their experience the first time and second time. How about in comparison, where we're looking at authentic assessment that they've done versus exams, and how they feel about those different types of assessment models?
I don't know if I've seen anything recently. Danielle, in your travels, have you seen anything in this area?
So I looked at some of the literature, Amanda, when I was writing my paper on assessment hurdles. So students do like non-exam based things because there is significant, like there are quite a few literature reviews which show that assignment based assessments do lead to mark inflation. So lots of students prefer that rather than exams because it kind of is easier to score in those exams.
That's interesting. I think my students said they preferred an online exam than a paper-based exam, but I haven't, I guess, compared the same subset of students to give them an authentic assessment. I think that would be a really interesting study to try and figure that out. And again, this comes back to that authentic exams and authentic assessment and exams. The question is, are they mutually exclusive? I don't think they are mutually exclusive to that same extent. I think that there is a way to design exams that could potentially be authentic in some way. Now, I can see Tom has his hand up. So, Tom, have you got a question?
Oh.
Hey, Tom, go ahead.
Okay, first, I've got to turn the audio on first.
Yeah, we can hear you now.
You can hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, that's good. Yes, I guess I think there might be the sense in which academics think that professional accreditation bodies want something which they don't really want. I'm on the committee which oversees computing profession accreditation at the Australian Computer Society, and they're not looking for invigilation of traditional paper-based exams. What they want are realistic tasks the students do, practice-based things. They want assurance the students actually did it, but they want realistic assessments. And if there's a mix of tasks, give the students lots of little quizzes and things to do, as long as that doesn't count too much. Give them a few big realistic exercises where they have to actually do something in a workplace or a simulation in a team. And I think that makes accreditation bodies much more comfortable than we ran all our students through a 3-hour online exam where we videoed them all the time. I think
that's where, invigilation. I think most academics would agree with you that we'd like to do something that is reflective of the world of work, is work integrated, and the assessors, or I guess the people that review accreditation requirements for the accounting bodies, we welcome doing something else. I think that the struggle that I find as an academic is thinking about doing something else and I'd love to try it. It's going to be very highly intensive in terms of people power and marking and spaces and a range of other things. And I think, okay, will I get that approved? And I guess my only way is to try. But efficiency is a word that seems to, through COVID-19, have come through into everything. Oh, we've let a whole lot of people go for voluntary redundancies. Now we're going to look at getting more efficiencies out of our workforce, and I feel that feels like a bit of a pressure. I don't know about anybody else.
Well, some of us have been trained in how to design courses and assessment where you calculate the staff time needed for the exam, and if you're going to propose a different form of assessment, you calculate it and you submit your budget for the time required, and you make sure that it isn't higher. And that's just how you should routinely design things. COVID-19 made it interesting because I had to flip the part of the blended program to the online mode, but apart from that, it's just business as usual. I think academics have to stop being a bit precious and start learning their craft, which is education and research.
Well, I love that comment there, and I think that echoes a lot of what has been discussed about. Is it? And I think I saw an article. I can't remember where it was. It's been circulating on Twitter that all we need to do to improve the situation is put every higher education educator through essentially teacher certification and teacher training, which I don't think I necessarily agree with, but I think it's really important. You raised a great point about learning the craft of teaching and the craft of assessment. I know that I sort of didn't get advice to do any formal training when I came into higher education, and it was just things that work well, keep going. Things that you try that you don't like, don't worry about it. And I think for myself, some formal structure in that process. I've designed for myself. I've done my own research. I've attended, read books, all the rest of it. But I think that could be a really interesting. I think that's something that we all need to think about doing. And I don't know about any of my other panelists, but we are talking more about assessment than we ever have before. We're probably as academics spending more time designing assessment than before. People say, look, I feel like I'm doing more than I did before. And I said, well, okay, this comes back to 40-40-20. 40-40-20 is 2 days on teaching, full days, the entirety of the day doing teaching and teaching related activities. And I suspect that in the past, perhaps not everybody was spending those 2 full days doing assessment prep and course design and those types of things. And perhaps we were borrowing some time from our teaching allocation to put into the research allocation, which we know that a lot of institutions, and there's lots of discussion about whether that is more important or not. And maybe this process and COVID-19 and what we've been experiencing and the change in assessments is helping us rebalance back to that 40-40-20. I don't know if anybody else would like to share any thoughts on that one.
I think that also I'll add in that we risk exhausting young academics and then them going out into industry, because there's a few junior academics in my school who have come to me several times and gone, this is exhausting. I'm writing 10 exam papers. When am I going to get time for research? Should they switch to go to an accounting firm? So I do think we're risking, by having this process, turning people off academia. I think that's something we need to be aware of. Well, there's no jobs, but then there'll be only a few of us, and there'll be a small subsection of us actually invested in designing assessment or thinking about these kinds of things. So yeah.
And if I can chip in, Amanda, of course the issue, the advancement of careers and so on has essentially, and we know, largely been based on research, and pedagogical research doesn't always get them in high regards. So it's the name of the game. And so interestingly, I recently read the Vice Chancellor of ANU did make the comment that the rankings are going to become less important now because essentially there's less international fee income to subsidise research. And of course, most of the research rankings are largely, or at least the world ranking of universities are around research. So if you haven't got the money to do research, then so the incentives around being a great teacher and great pedagogy and great assessments haven't always been largely rewarded in university, even where they have teaching focused positions. Advancing beyond a level C or level D is pretty difficult.
Liz, did you have any thoughts? I could see you unmuted your microphone.
Well, look, I was thinking about the opportunity to really share ideas quite openly amongst fellow academics, and maybe that's not something that was done so much in the past. I think there might have been more like your silos, and nobody really had those open discussions. But I think I've seen certainly at QUT a willingness to really actually look at how other people are approaching it, and advantages and disadvantages of that approach. If you go with a whole downloadable Word exam, well, obviously there's pitfalls to that and advantages. So I think having more willingness to really collaborate amongst each other and share those good ideas and what is working and what isn't working. I think we need more of that.
Amanda, can I just comment?
Sorry. Yes, Phil. No, go for it.
What Liz has said, so some of you may or may not know about the Achievement Matters project that started in 2010. Karen's left now, but Karen was certainly one of the early participants in that, and that was funded by professional accounting bodies and so on. So that's basically looking at, so here's their accounting learning standards. How do we know students are actually meeting those learning standards? So how do we provide assessment tasks which enable us to allow students to demonstrate their ability to meet the learning standards? And so what Liz was saying, part of that was sharing assessments. So sharing assessments was readily done. The project came to an end, and it is actually a special interest group now. It's SIG Calibration of Learning Standards that I sort of convene. But obviously with COVID, it's been a bit hard to run the workshop, so we haven't done anything for a little while. But certainly what Liz is doing out there was an active part of our group, sharing assessments tasks, and it was fantastic. So I absolutely encourage it. The more we do of that, the better.
I think at the moment in accounting, certainly one struggle might be, where do we share those? Where is it secure? Yeah. And how do we do that? And we mentioned that, Phil mentioned that the game is research that's within the discipline specific. There's less kudos given to research into education pedagogy, which Nicola Beatson says, look, this is the R&D of higher education, right? Why aren't we investing in our own research and development? The accounting research shows that firms that innovate and invest in innovation have a better future payoff. So why don't we do that if teaching and attracting great students is going to be, really important in the future? And that even comes back to the titles. I was looking at this in North America. And so I'm a level C and I'm education focused. If there is a track for me to level E eventually, but in some countries, the track, even the names of the positions are different from people who are education specialists versus the people who are what we would, be calling discipline-specific researchers. So that's even just that treatment, those subtle signals among there could be really interesting. And Harsha said in the comments that health disciplines value pedagogical research, business disciplines, it's a bit of a difficult thing. I actually approached CA and CPA towards the end of 2020, and I said, look, is it possible for you to share some of these exemplars of what people have said they're doing and how, if they're choosing not to invigilate in an exam, how they're doing that. And they were really close-lipped. And it was like, well, you can approach institutions and ask them themselves. It certainly is some way, I don't know whether maybe through the chairs of accounting and finance or the accounting education SIG or this business one, if there's some way that we can share some of that practice just to help spark ideas even. And, big thank you to Victoria, who started the iHeart Accounting Education Teams group, where people were, she was sharing practice and, oh, look, here's a guide that I made for my students, people asking about assessments. I think one of the silver linings has been the increase in collegiality. I don't think I've had so many staff meetings. We talk about teaching and learning at least once a week, and we now have a weekly staff meeting amongst our discipline, whereas I think we had 2 staff meetings a year prior to that. And the fact that we're having something weekly, we're talking about our challenges weekly, that's probably the biggest silver lining. As we start to wind up towards the end of our time, does anyone have any other silver linings that they'd like to share? Anybody?
I'd agree, Amanda. I think there's been a silver lining in sharing effective teaching strategies, obviously in an online mode, but I think that opens up lots of ideas around, again, people often maybe don't discuss what is working well in that teaching space. So to be able to, freely give suggestions and even maybe how to reorganize your Blackboard site or, whatever it might be to improve the student experience. And, budget cuts are hitting, hard and fast. So how can we work smarter to still give that student experience, as best as we can? That's I think, the positive for me, I guess.
Victoria, any other silver linings?
I think it's been great to be able to share our different, ways we do things, different assessments, like the I Love Accounting Education team site that Amanda and I have. That's been really good, because at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, I realized that we need to have a...
Oh, we've lost Victoria. She's frozen.
We need to share resources to support each other. Otherwise, some of us would just sink. So that's been a good thing, because it used to be people would describe to me teaching at a university is it's a private thing. People go in a room, presenting adults, and something happens, but it's never discussed. On that.
Phil, any silver linings for you out of all of this?
Well, I like the idea, I think it was you that mentioned it, where a whole lot of educators was at marketing got together and developed a whole lot of potential questions. I used to sit on the CPA external reporting panel, and one of our functions was to develop MCQs for the CPA financial reporting module. And there was 3 or 4 of us involved in that. It took quite a bit of time to develop great questions, but I like that idea. I think as a group, if we were to have sort of a means by which we can develop a whole lot of questions which we can then share in a secure place. Because taking the time to develop these questions, I know my philosophy lecturers last year, they developed some questions that took them a long time, and they were loath to share their questions with anyone. They were very protective around these questions. In the online exams, they were worried that they might somehow get out. So, but I think that's a great idea to pursue.
And I think, the thing is we have to do this regularly, because once they're in an online exam, you can just assume that they're out there in the public. So it's something that we have to do over and over again. And exam recycling is something that we've had a big challenge with. Fantastic. Well, to finish up for tonight, and I'm just going to go back to our slide deck. Hang on, and I will find the right slide. Here we go. So thank you everybody for coming along tonight. And in the morning, depending on where you are. We'd love to welcome you to join the Accreditation Business Education SIG. I'm going to put the link to that in the chat. It's absolutely free. There's nothing, you don't have to be an Ascolite member to join the Business Education SIG. We welcome people from business education all around the world. Our next webinar is going to be on technology enhanced responsible management education. That's on Tuesday, the 11th of May. If you can follow the Ascolite Business Education SIG on Twitter, follow me on Twitter or on Instagram, we'll post the registration link for that as we get a little bit closer. But we have Associate Professor Harsh Suri from Deakin, along with Vivek, and I can never say Vivek's surname, so I won't attempt to garble it there, from Deakin, and Associate Professor Christian Schott from Victoria University in Wellington. So I want to thank everybody for coming along tonight. I'm going to figure out how to download the chat and then take all of those great tips and put them into our Padlet. I'll also send that Padlet link out and information about the recording to everybody who registered. It'll also go up on our Ascolite Business Education SIG page, and I'll share it on all of my socials. So thank you everybody for coming along, and we look forward to welcoming you to the next Business Education SIG. Shout out to all the accounting people who have come out tonight from a whole range of different unis. I recognize lots of familiar names. So thank you everyone for supporting us, and we shall see you next time.
Thanks, Amanda. Well done.
Thank you.
Thanks, Amanda.
Thanks.
For anybody who's not familiar, you just close the browser window, and that is how you leave. I couldn't figure that out the first time I used Collaborate, but you can just close the browser window, and that'll exit you out of the meeting.